Are the committee members and owners required to minute or document all conflict of interests and or declaration of benefits so that all owners are aware of the circumstances in relation to financial decisions being made and contractor proposals being sourced? For example, a chairperson is married to a committee member. The chairperson submits a contractor proposal for their spouse's business for $20,000 work without seeking more than one quote to compare value for money and service. The chairperson does not declare the conflict of interest by stating the business is owned by their spouse, and then does not declare the financial benefit they gain if this contract is approved. No record of the committee member and chairperson's relationship or connection to the business are stated in the meeting, nor recorded prior and circulated for owners to peruse and question. So this is a good question. And the conflict of interest rules are quite clear, but they don't necessarily go as far as this questioner is asking. So firstly, there are conflict of interest rules that apply to committees. So anything that a committee member does as a committee member is subject to conflict of interest rules. And I say committee member because owners at a general meeting, so owners at an AGM or owners at an EGM, are not required to disclose conflict of interest. So if I wanted to engage myself, or if I wanted to be paid, $20,000 to do work, and I put that question directly to owners, I do not need to disclose my conflict of interest at an AGM or at an EGM. So it is assumed that everybody at an AGM or an EGM is voting for their own best interests, and they are not held to a higher standard. So committee members, on the other hand, are elected members, and they need to make decisions on behalf of the whole group, not just on behalf of themselves. And that's where you get this conflict of interest coming into play. So anytime a committee member has a conflict of interest or a potential conflict of interest, they need to not vote on any matters relating to that conflict of interest item. So in this case, it's totally legitimate and fine for a committee member to source a quotation from, a relative, or they could put in a contract proposal themselves if it's something that they're experts in. Or, in this case, they could get a proposal from their spouse's business. So the getting of the proposal is totally fine. What would then need to happen is the chairperson who proposed that contract would need to bow out of any decisions about that contract. They could still participate in the discussion, and they could sit at the meeting and say, look, I got this quote from, my spouse because, the person is great at their job and they, run a really successful business doing painting or whatever the work is for. And they could give the pros and cons and be part of the discussion. But when it comes to having the committee members vote about whether to adopt that agreement or not, the chairperson who proposed the agreement and has a conflict of interest would not be allowed to vote. They would need to abstain from that vote. Similarly, if any of the other committee members had another conflict of interest in relation to that proposal or a potential conflict of interest, they would need to abstain as well. So it would take all of the conflicted members out of the decision-making process, and the members who are left would be the people who are at arm's length from the transaction. Those are the people who would be making that decision. That conflict of interest does not need to be stated in the minutes. It probably should be, and we would advise our committees, if they're having this type of conflict of interest issue come up, to make detailed notes and say, look, the chairperson arranged this proposal. They recommended it because it was a related party to them, and they feel they've got a good working relationship with this person. Due to the conflict of interest, the chairperson stepped out of the room for the discussion of the proposal and then abstained from the committee vote when the committee decided to go ahead with the quote. So we would recommend, just from a best practice perspective, to include a very brief comment about the chairperson does have a conflict and stepped out of the meeting or abstained from the vote. We probably would not go and explain, or we would not recommend they explain exactly what the financial benefits are. That's not required because the member is abstaining completely. So as long as a member abstains, that meets the law, and any further disclosure would just be up to the committee to decide if that were appropriate in the circumstances. And there's always grey area with conflict of interest, but a lawyer once said to me, and I think this is a good motto, if you're even asking the question of whether you've got a conflict of interest or not, then you do have a conflict of interest. Because if something was totally at arm's length from you and you had no conflict of interest, it wouldn't even cross your mind that you might have one. So you're avoiding a conflict of interest and also the potential conflict of interest. But the disclosure to owners, it can leave a bitter taste in owners' mouths if they find out later that the chairperson did have a conflict. Even if the chairperson did the correct thing and abstained from voting, it's usually not a good look for a committee to appoint, a fairly large contract to family member of a committee member or a committee member directly, because of that potential where owners, feel that the process was not conducted transparently, I should say. So even though the law only requires the abstaining of the member, I think it is a good idea for the owners to be informed about it. And, usually these types of conflict of interest are quite innocent, and that the person genuinely thinks that their, family member or their old school friend is the best person for the job. It's quite unusual to find any committee members who are actively concealing a conflict of interest. If that's the case, that committee probably has much bigger problems than, the engagement of this one contractor. And that's something that owners should take into account when they're electing their committees at each AGM.